The Crethean Empire had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years, and their warships were feared across 100 star systems. Commander Vexith stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the sensors as they detected something unusual near the edge of the Talus system. An unknown vessel drifted in space, and it was small compared to the massive Crethean warships that surrounded it. The ship had a smooth hull that reflected starlight in strange patterns, and there were no visible weapons or engines. Vexith ordered his crew to scan the vessel and prepare a boarding party, because he assumed it was another primitive species waiting to be conquered. The Cretheans had done this countless times before, and every encounter ended the same way, with submission or destruction. But when the Crethean warship moved closer, something impossible happened. The unknown ship simply vanished from existence, and every sensor showed empty space where it had been just moments before. The crew checked their instruments repeatedly, but found nothing wrong with their equipment. The ship had not jumped to faster than light travel, and it had not activated any cloaking device. It was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. Vexith felt confusion mixed with anger, because in 3 decades of military service he had never seen anything like this before. On board the human vessel Wanderer, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched the alien warship through his displays and smiled slightly. His crew had been observing the Crethean Empire for 6 months now, and they had learned how the Empire operated. The Cretheans conquered weaker species and stripped their worlds of resources before moving on to the next target. Morrison had orders from Earth to observe only and never reveal humanity's existence, but those orders were becoming harder to follow with each passing day. Lisa Parker sat at the navigation console, and she was young but extremely talented at operating the quantum displacement drive. This technology allowed the Wanderer to stop existing in one location and instantly begin existing in another, without crossing the space between. No other species in the galaxy had discovered this yet, and it gave humanity an incredible advantage. Danny Cruz monitored the sensors from his station, and he was tracking 12 Crethean capital ships in this sector alone. The fleet was preparing for something big, and Cruz noticed patterns in their communications that suggested an upcoming invasion. Morrison leaned back in his chair and made a decision that would change galactic history forever. He ordered Cruz to tap into the Crethean communications and translate what they were saying. Within minutes, the truth became clear, and Morrison felt his jaw tighten with anger. The Cretheans were planning to attack a world called Pendra, where a peaceful species had just developed radio technology. The invasion would begin in 4 days, and the Pendrans would be given a simple choice between submission and death. Morrison knew his orders, but he also knew what was right. He had been a fighter pilot before joining the exploration program, and he had sworn an oath to protect the innocent. He ordered his crew to prepare a message for Earth Command, explaining the situation, while the Wanderer continued to shadow the Crethean fleet. Over the next 4 days, Morrison and his team documented everything about Crethean military operations, including their weapon systems and shield frequencies and command structures. The Cretheans never suspected they were being watched, because their technology could not detect the Wanderer even when it was just a few hundred meters away. When the Crethean fleet reached Pendra, Morrison watched from orbit as the aliens delivered their ultimatum to the planet below. The Pendrans tried to negotiate and offered friendship and cultural exchange, but the Cretheans responded by destroying 3 cities from orbit. Morrison saw the fires spreading across the continents and heard the screams through the communication channels. His crew sat in shocked silence, and Lisa Parker's hands were shaking as she gripped her console. Danny Cruz had his fists clenched so tight that his knuckles turned white. Parker spoke first and asked if they could do something to help. Morrison started to mention their orders, but Cruz interrupted him with unusual force. The censor officer pointed out that their orders did not cover genocide, and there were millions of innocent people dying below. Morrison looked at the displays showing the burning cities and the Crethean ships preparing for a second bombardment. He thought about regulations and protocols and the chain of command, but he also thought about what it meant to be human. Morrison made his decision and ordered Parker to bring the Wanderer within 1,000 meters of the Crethean flagship. He told Cruz to hack into their targeting systems and make every weapon in the fleet point at empty space. Then he ordered Parker to jump the ship directly onto the bridge of the flagship for exactly 2 seconds so the Cretheans could see what they were facing. Parker smiled as she understood the plan, because this was psychological warfare at its finest, What happened next would become legend across the galaxy. The Crethean fleet suddenly lost control of all their weapon systems and targeting computers failed across every ship. Power systems fluctuated wildly, and then for exactly 2 seconds a strange vessel appeared on Commander Vexith's bridge. The ship was so close that Vexith could see through its transparent hull to the beings inside. They stood on 2 legs like many species, but there was something different about them. One of them in the center looked directly at Vexith and smiled before the ship vanished. Again, Vexith had protocols for every military situation, but nothing in Crethean history prepared him for ships that could appear inside other ships and then disappear without a trace. He made the only logical decision and ordered his fleet to retreat to the edge of the system. Within hours, he sent an urgent message to the Imperial High Command requesting reinforcements and guidance. The response came quickly and told him to hold position while a much larger force was assembled to deal with this new threat. The Crethean Empire had existed for 3,000 years and had never encountered an enemy like this before. They did not know that they had just made first contact with humanity, and they did not know that this single encounter would lead to their downfall. The unknown ship had appeared and then vanished, but the consequences of that moment would reshape the entire galaxy forever. The Crethean reinforcements arrived 3 days later, and it was not a small patrol but a full battle group with 30 capital ships and hundreds of support vessels. Admiral Cormath took personal command of the fleet because he was a veteran of dozens of campaigns, and the High Command wanted their best officer handling this situation. Cormath demanded to see the recordings of the unknown ship and watched them multiple times with growing concern. The vessel appeared from nowhere, and the beings inside were visible through walls that seemed made of light. One of them had smiled at Commander Vexith, and that smile disturbed Cormath more than any weapon could. The fleet scientist named Threx examined the data and admitted that the technology was beyond anything the Cretheans understood. The ship did not move through normal space and left no trace of its passage. Threx suggested it might exist and not exist at the same time, but he could not explain how such a thing was possible. Cormath grew impatient with speculation and demanded to know if they could fight this enemy. Threx clicked his mandibles nervously and said he simply did not know because they had never encountered anything like this before. Cormath decided to resume the assault on Pendra because he believed the unknown ship could not resist defending the planet again. His plan was simple, and when the ghost ship appeared, his fleet would surround it with so many vessels that escape would be impossible. Even if the ship could teleport, it could not teleport through solid matter, and they would capture it and take its technology. The bombardment of Pendra began again, and Crethean weapons lit up the atmosphere as cities burned below. The Wanderer appeared exactly as Cormath predicted, but this time Morrison positioned his ship directly in the path of an orbital bombardment beam. For 3 seconds, the Wanderer absorbed energy that should have vaporized any vessel before vanishing again. Cormath watched in disbelief as the ghost ship took a direct hit from their most powerful weapon and simply disappeared without leaving any debris. Threx reported that the ship had absorbed several gigajoules of energy and then vanished as if the laws of physics meant nothing to it. But Morrison had not actually absorbed the energy at all. He had simply jumped the Wanderer away the instant the beam struck and used the flash of impact to mask their displacement. Now the ship hovered 10,000 kilometers distant and completely undetected by Crethean sensors. Crews reported that the enemy fleet was panicking and running scans in the wrong direction. Morrison ordered Parker to prepare for multiple jumps because they were going to appear in 5 different locations over the next hour to make the Cretheans think. There were multiple ships. What followed became known as the harassment at Pendra. The Wanderer appeared and vanished 17 times over the next hour, and each appearance was calculated to cause maximum confusion. Once it materialized inside a Crethean hangar bay and startled hundreds of pilots. Another time it hovered directly above Cormath's command ship, where every bridge officer could see it. Each appearance lasted only seconds, but each one drove the Cretheans closer to panic. Ships began firing at shadows, and sensor operators reported contacts that did not exist. 3 Crethean vessels accidentally shot at each other in the confusion. Commander Vexith urged Cormath to withdraw because this enemy was unlike anything they had faced before. The Admiral argued that they outnumbered the ghost ship 30-1, but Vexith pointed out they could not hit what they could not see. Every time they fired, they wasted energy, and every time the ghost ship appeared, their crews lost confidence. Cormath knew Vexith was right, but retreat was unthinkable because the Krethian Empire had never fled from an inferior force. Threx suggested a new strategy and explained that the appearances were not truly random. There was a pattern, and the ghost ship was trying to protect the Pendrin evacuation. If they threatened the refugee ships directly, the ghost vessel would have to reveal itself for longer periods. Cormath seized on this idea and ordered his fleet to target the Pendrin moons where the evacuations were taking place. Vexith protested that those were civilians, but Cormath coldly stated they were acceptable losses in a strategic victory. Morrison watched as the Krethian fleet began moving toward the moons, and he had known this moment would come. The Krethians were predators, and predators always went for the weak and defenseless. Crews confirmed they were charging weapons and targeting the evacuation sites. Morrison knew they could not stop 30 ships with firepower alone, because the Wanderer had no weapons, but they could do something better and make the Krethians stop themselves through fear and confusion. Morrison ordered crews to hack every ship in the fleet simultaneously and asked if it was possible. Crew studied his console and ran calculations before saying he could maybe do it but would need 10 minutes. Morrison told him he had 5 minutes because in 5 minutes the Krethians would be in firing range of the refugees. Crew's fingers moved across his console with incredible speed as the Wanderer's quantum processors sliced through Krethian firewalls like they were made of paper. Within 5 minutes, Cruz announced he was inside all 30 ships and asked what Morrison wanted him to do. Morrison thought carefully about his options. He could disable their weapons, but that would only delay the inevitable. He could turn their weapons on each other, but that would make him responsible for mass death. He needed something that would make them leave and never come back. Morrison ordered Cruz to upload a virus that would make every Krethian ship think the Wanderer was everywhere at once. On their sensors, they should see thousands of ghost ships surrounding them from all directions. Cruz smiled as he understood and said it was not a virus but a nightmare. The upload completed in seconds, and on 30 Krethian bridges' sensor displays suddenly showed thousands of contacts. The ghost ship had been multiplied beyond comprehension and surrounded the fleet in a sphere of certain death. Cormath shouted for evasive maneuvers, but there was nowhere to evade because every direction showed enemy vessels. Every screen displayed the same strange ship that could appear and disappear at will. Threx frantically studied his instruments and declared it was impossible because there could not be this many ships. One of the sensor contacts moved closer to a Krethian destroyer, and the crew panicked and fired every weapon they had. The beams passed through empty space, but the contact remained hovering like a patient predator. Cormath ordered the entire fleet to fire on all contacts simultaneously to prove they were illusions. 30 capital ships and hundreds of support craft opened fire at once and poured enough energy into space to sterilize a planet. Through it all, the sensor contacts remained unchanged and thousands of ghost ships appeared untouched and unfazed by the attack. Cormath whispered the order to retreat and then shouted it louder. The entire fleet made emergency faster than light jumps and fled Pendra at maximum speed. On the moons below, Pendrin refugees looked up and saw their destroyers disappear. They did not understand why or how, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Morrison watched the Krethian fleet flee and allowed himself a small smile. They had just declared war on an interstellar empire, but they had also shown that humanity would not tolerate bullies. What happened next would depend on how the Krethians responded to their defeat. The news of the defeat at Pendra spread through the Krethian Empire like wildfire, and the sensor logs could not be explained away. Something had defeated their fleet without firing a single shot and made 30 warships flee in terror. The Imperial High Council gathered on Krethia Prime, where 12 admirals representing 12 sectors met in the Chamber of Conquest. Above them hung the flags of 1,000 defeated species, but now those flags seemed to mock them with the memory of easier victories. High Admiral Zethrak was the eldest of the council, and he addressed the others with grim determination. They faced an unknown enemy that struck from nowhere and vanished without trace. This enemy could appear inside their ships and mock their weapons. Admiral Vren commanded the Fifth Fleet, and he scoffed at the idea of fleeing from one ship. He argued they should gather overwhelming force and bring 300 ships or 3,000 if necessary. Admiral Krell was more cautious and asked what would happen if the enemy had more than one ship. They knew nothing about this species, including their technology or numbers or intentions. Zethrak stated that their intentions were clear because they had defended the Pendrins and made the Krethian Empire look weak. Whether they meant it or not, they had declared war. The council debated for hours, and some argued for overwhelming force while others suggested negotiation, though the word tasted bitter. A few suggested simply avoiding any system where the ghost ship appeared, but that was unthinkable. In the end, Zethrak made the decision to assemble the Grand Fleet with every available warship from every sector. They would return to Pendra and draw out the enemy, and when it appeared they would capture it through sheer numbers. Once they had the technology, they would use it to expand the Empire beyond anything their ancestors dreamed. Meanwhile, on Earth, Morrison's message had finally arrived after traveling for months at light speed. Admiral Helen Brooks commanded Earth's Space Defense Initiative, and she read the report 3 times before calling an emergency meeting. She told the assembled representatives that humanity was not alone in the universe, and their neighbors were hostile. She played Morrison's recordings showing Krethian warships bombarding cities and fleets, stripping planets and conquered species forced into slavery. Then she showed them the Wanderer's intervention and the fleet that fled in terror. Brooks admitted that Morrison had acted outside his orders by revealing humanity's existence to an aggressive alien empire. Under normal circumstances, she would recommend punishment, but Ambassador Chen pointed out these were not normal circumstances because Morrison had saved millions of lives. General Petrov argued that Morrison had painted a target on Earth, and when the Empire found them, they would come with everything they had. President Martinez was young for a president, but she understood what Morrison had done and why. She asked how many ships like the Wanderer they had now. Brooks reported 12 operational ships and another 20 in various stages of construction. They had trained 240 crew members in quantum displacement navigation. Martinez asked what would happen if they built weapons into these ships, and Brooks explained the displacement drive required enormous power, so adding weapons would reduce jump range significantly. Martinez asked if it was possible, and Brooks confirmed it was. Martinez looked around the table at the other leaders and saw fear in some faces, but determination in others. Humanity had always been good at adapting and fighting, and now they would have to do both on a galactic scale. Martinez called for a vote to approve emergency military production because they were going to build an armada. The vote was unanimous, and over the next 6 weeks, Earth transformed itself into a war machine. Shipyards in lunar orbit ran 3 shifts continuously, and quantum displacement drives were mass-produced. Every nation contributed resources and personnel, and old rivalries were forgotten. Admiral Brooks stood in the observation deck of Lunar Station Prime, watching dozens of ships take shape in the construction bays below. President Martinez asked how many ships they would have when the Krethians arrived. Brooks reported 67 combat-ready ships and another 100 in various stages of construction. They were training crews as fast as possible, but quantum navigation took months to learn. Martinez asked about weapons, and Brooks explained they had developed 3 new systems. Quantum missiles could teleport directly inside enemy ships, and electromagnetic pulse generators could disable systems without destroying vessels. The third weapon was experimental antimatter. Lances that combined displacement, technology with matter annihilation. Martinez asked how effective these weapons were, and Brooks admitted they did not know because they had not tested them in combat. But simulations suggested they would be devastating. Martinez stated she wanted to do more than defend Earth, because she wanted to send a message that humanity was not prey. Across the solar system, preparations continued as Mars converted its industries to military production, and asteroid mining operations extracted materials at unprecedented rates. Jupiter's moons became training grounds where new crews learned to operate the displacement drives far from Earth. Beyond Pluto, construction began on the gateway stations, which were massive structures housing quantum generators powerful enough to move entire fleets instantaneously. If the Krethians found Earth, humanity would be able to deploy forces anywhere in the solar system within seconds. Morrison and his crew were being debriefed by military intelligence, and they shared everything they had learned during 6 months in Krethian space. Morrison explained that the Empire was spread thin across hundreds of systems, and most forces were devoted to occupation and resource extraction. They did not expect resistance because every species they encountered had either submitted or been destroyed. Admiral Hayes commanded the newly formed Earth Defense Fleet and asked about Krethian technology. Morrison admitted they were ahead in raw power with bigger ships and harder-hitting weapons. But they were predictable and used the same tactics for thousands of years because those tactics always worked. Hayes asked about leadership, and Morrison explained the rigid hierarchy where orders flowed from top down, and junior officers never questioned senior officers. It was a strength in coordination, but also a weakness because if you killed the command ship, the rest of the fleet would falter. 6 months after the battle at Pendra, the Krethian Empire finally located Earth through pure persistence. They had sent scouts to every system within 100 light-years of Pendra and searched methodically. A Krethian probe entered the Sol system and detected electromagnetic radiation organized into patterns. It recorded industrial activity on multiple worlds and noted dozens of ships matching the ghost vessel configuration. The probe transmitted its findings and self-destructed. Before human sensors could respond, Admiral Zethrak received the report with grim satisfaction and ordered the Armada assembled with every ship and weapon and soldier. They would not make the same mistakes again. The Krethian Armada took 3 weeks to assemble and was twice the size of the Grand Fleet. 600 capital ships and 4,000 support vessels represented half the Empire's total military strength. They would jump directly to Earth and establish orbital supremacy and give the humans one chance to surrender. If refused, they would reduce Earth to ash. On Earth, sensors detected massive energy buildup at the edge of Krethian space and gravitational distortions as hundreds of ships prepared to jump. Brooks announced to the Security Council that the enemy was coming and estimated 3 days until arrival. Martinez asked if they were ready, and Brooks honestly said no because they would never be ready for what was coming. But they were as prepared as possible with the fleet deployed and gateway stations online and every weapon charged. Martinez declared they would give the Krethians the fight of their lives and make them regret finding Earth. Morrison watched from the Wanderer and felt pride mixed with fear, and underneath it all a cold determination. The Krethians had conquered hundreds of species and committed genocide for convenience. But they had never fought humanity, and they were about to learn that was a fatal mistake. The Krethian Armada jumped into the Sol system exactly on schedule, and 600 ships appeared in a flash of distorted space. Admiral Zethrak stood on the bridge of his super dreadnought Eternal Conquest and watched as sensors began cataloging every planet and moon and ship in the system. What they found made him pause because there were only 67 ships detected in Earth orbit, and all matched the ghost ship configuration. Additional contacts appeared throughout the system near the gas giant and asteroid belt and red planet, but the numbers seemed surprisingly small. Zethrak's mandibles clicked in confusion as he wondered why the humans had so few ships. They had 12 at Pendra and months to prepare, so where was their fleet? His tactical officer suggested perhaps that was all they had, or perhaps it was a trick. Zethrak agreed it was definitely a trick, but stated they had 600 ships against 67. Even if every human vessel could teleport, they had overwhelming numbers. He ordered the fleet to advance toward Earth at maximum speed and estimated the battle would be decided in minutes once they reached orbit. Morrison watched the armadas advance from his position near Mars, and the Wanderer's sensors tracked every ship and formation and weapon signature. Parker commented they were really bringing everything, and Morrison replied they could only hope humanity's everything was enough. He ordered all ships to execute Plan Echo Phase 1, and across the solar system 67 human ships vanished simultaneously. They reappeared seconds later, not in front of the Armada but behind it. Every ship positioned itself near a Krethian supply vessel or command ship, targeting the crucial support craft that kept the massive fleet functioning. Morrison gave the order to fire, and 67 quantum missiles launched. Each missile teleported directly inside its target, and the Krethian shields could not block attacks that appeared inside the shield perimeter. Explosions blossomed across the rear of the Armada as supply ships and command vessels erupted in flames. Zethrak's sensor officer screamed that rear formations were under attack and multiple ships were destroyed. Zethrak ordered the fleet to turn and engage the ghost vessels, but by the time the Armada began its ponderous turn, the human ships had already jumped away. They reappeared near Jupiter, regrouping at the gateway station there. Morrison reported Phase 1 complete with enemy casualties at 43 ships destroyed and another 60 damaged. Human casualties were 0. Brooks acknowledged from Earth Command and stated they were proceeding to Phase 2. Morrison allowed himself a tight smile because the Krethians had numbers, but humanity had tactics and technology, and something the Empire had never encountered. They had a species that learned from every fight and adapted to every challenge and refused to give up. Admiral Zethrak stared at his tactical display, trying to understand what he was seeing. 43 ships destroyed in the first engagement, and his fleet had not fired a single shot. The ghost ships had struck from behind and hit vulnerable targets and vanished before retaliation was possible. His tactical officer reported all supply vessels in rear formations destroyed, and 6 command ships disabled, and 17 escort vessels damaged. Forward battle groups were unaffected, but their logistics chain was compromised. Zethrak asked if they could continue the advance and was told they had approximately 6 hours at combat readiness. Before power reserves began depleting, Zethrak felt his mandibles clench because the humans had cut his operational window to 6 hours with one strike. They had done it without losing a single ship. He ordered the fleet to resume advance and maintain maximum sensor sweeps, because the moment those ghost ships appeared, he wanted overwhelming fire on their positions. The armada continued toward Earth, but now the formation was tighter and more defensive. Ships clustered together with overlapping sensor ranges and fields of fire. It was a formation designed to prevent ambush, but it would not work against an enemy that could appear anywhere. Brooks announced from Earth Command that Phase 2 was initiating, and all gateway stations executed displacement protocol. The gateway stations activated their quantum generators, which were designed not to move themselves but to move other ships. Near Jupiter, 30 human ships vanished and reappeared instantly near Mars, where another 20 ships were waiting. The combined force of 50 vessels now occupied the space between the Krethian Armada and Earth. Morrison opened a channel to the Krethian flagship and told Admiral Zethrak he was 6 hours from Earth at current speed and would never make it. He offered one final chance to turn back while they still could. Zethrak replied they had 50 ships against 600, and human defiance was admirable but futile. Morrison offered a last chance, and Zethrak coldly stated no, and gave Morrison the last chance instead. Surrender now, and humanity would be allowed to live as servants of the Empire, or refuse and watch Earth burn. Morrison cut the channel and stated the Admiral had made his choice. He ordered all ships to execute Plan Echo Phase 2, and declared they would show the Krethians what humanity could do. The human fleet split into 5 groups of 10 ships each, and every group jumped to a different position around the Krethian Armada. They formed a 3-dimensional perimeter above and below and to each side, effectively boxing in the much larger force. Zethrak's tactical officer reported enemy contacts at all vectors and stated they were surrounded. Zethrak declared it impossible because they could not attack from all directions simultaneously. He was right, but they did not need to. Each group of 10 human ships activated electromagnetic pulse generators in sequence, creating waves of disrupting energy that washed over the Krethian fleet. The pulses did not destroy ships but disabled systems as sensors went dark and weapons went offline and shield. Generators flickered and failed. The tactical officer shouted that all systems were compromised and they were blind and defenseless. Zethrak ordered emergency reboots of all systems and demanded shields at full power. The Krethian ships began reboot sequences that would take 3 to 4 minutes. For a military vessel, 3 minutes of vulnerability was an eternity, and the human ships attacked. Quantum missiles teleported inside disabled Krethian vessels, targeting engines and power cores. Ships did not explode but simply went dark with power systems destroyed, and crews alive but helpless. The antimatter lances carved through Krethian capital ships like they were made of paper. In 10 minutes of coordinated assault, the human fleet disabled or destroyed 200 Krethian vessels. The armada that was the pride of the Empire was being systematically dismantled by a force 1/10 its size. Zethrak finally gave the order to retreat and shouted for all ships to make emergency faster than light jumps immediately. The armada began jumping away, but not in organized withdrawal but in panicked flight. Ships jumped individually without coordination, fleeing in all directions. Some collided during jump sequences, and others jumped into each other's exit vectors, creating gravitational chaos that destroyed a dozen more vessels. By the time the last Krethian ship vanished, the armada had lost nearly half its strength. 300 ships were destroyed or disabled in less than an hour, and the human fleet had not lost a single vessel. On Earth, celebrations erupted as humanity had faced an interstellar empire and won. But in command centers, military leaders knew this was just the beginning. Brooks ordered status reports and learned all human ships were operational, with minor damage to 3 vessels and no casualties. Enemy casualties included 274 ships destroyed and 86 disabled, with the remainder fled. Brooks ordered tracking of their jump vectors because she wanted to know where they were going. Sensors showed Crethean ships scattering in all directions, but the largest concentration headed back toward their home territory to regroup. Morrison stated over the command channel they had hurt the enemy badly, but had not broken them completely. They would return with reinforcements eventually. Brooks replied they would be ready, and next time they would not wait for the Cretheans to come to them. She asked Morrison how he would feel about taking the war to the enemy. Morrison considered the question carefully. For thousands of years, humanity had looked at stars and wondered if they were alone. Now they knew they were not alone, and their neighbors were conquerors. Earth could defend itself and had proven that, but defense was not enough. Morrison stated he would feel just fine about taking the offensive, because Earth had always produced explorers. And now it was time to become liberators too. The Crethean Empire had conquered 100 species and built their power on subjugation, but they had never fought an enemy that could strike from nowhere and vanish without trace and turn their own strength against them. On Crethia, Prime High Admiral Zethrak delivered his report to the Imperial Council, and the atmosphere in the chamber was heavy with shame and anger. He had lost half the armada to a species the Empire had dismissed as primitives, and worse, every species under Crethean control had heard about the defeat. Rebellions were already beginning on a dozen worlds as conquered peoples saw hope for the first time in generations. Admiral Vren demanded to know how they could fight an enemy they could not hit, and his voice carried frustration mixed with fear. Zethrak stated they must adapt because, for 3,000 years, their tactics had not changed. They had not needed to change because overwhelming force always worked against every species they encountered. But these humans forced them to evolve, and they would need to study human technology and develop countermeasures and return with greater strength. Admiral Krell asked what would happen if the humans attacked first instead of waiting. Zethrak's mandibles twitched nervously as he admitted they would learn what it felt like to be conquered by a superior force. Across the galaxy and systems, the Crethean Empire had subjugated. News of the battle for Earth spread like wildfire through secret channels. The invincible empire had been defeated and the conquering armada had fled in terror. Somewhere in the stars there was a species that fought back and won. Hope that had been absent for so long from so many worlds began to bloom again in the hearts of the oppressed. On Pendra, the world where everything began, refugees returned from the moons to find their cities damaged but their civilization intact. They looked to the stars and wondered about the ghost ships and the beings who had saved them twice. The Pendrans did not know humanity's name yet, and they did not know about Earth or Jake Morrison or the desperate gamble that started everything. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty, that they were no longer alone in their resistance against tyranny. And in the depths of space aboard the Wanderer, Morrison looked at tactical displays showing Crethean territory with its hundreds of systems and thousands of worlds. An empire that had ruled for millennia was about to face something it had never encountered before. Morrison broadcast to humanity's fleet and ordered all ships to prepare for extended deployment. They had people to free and an empire to teach them manners, and it was time to show the galaxy what humanity stood for. The crew of the Wanderer and 66 other ships jumped into the unknown, but not as conquerors seeking to build their own empire. They jumped as liberators determined to tear down an empire built on suffering and show the galaxy there was another way. The first target was a mining world called Zareth, where the native population had been enslaved 300 years earlier. The Cretheans had stripped the planet of valuable minerals using forced labor, and millions had died in the mines. A garrison of 12 Crethean warships enforced the occupation and kept the population in line through fear. Morrison's task force jumped into the system and appeared simultaneously around each garrison ship. Before the Cretheans could react, quantum missiles disabled their engines and weapons. The occupation force was neutralized in less than 2 minutes without a single shot fired in return. Morrison broadcast a message to the surface in the Zareth, language which crews had learned from captured Crethean databases. He told them they were free and the Crethean occupation was over. Humanity offered friendship and assistance but would not become new masters. The choice of what to do next belonged to the Zareth people alone. On the planet below, millions looked up at the sky as Crethean ships went dark and drifted powerless in orbit. They could not believe what they were seeing because freedom was something they had only dreamed about in secret. The liberation of Zareth was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, human ships appeared in system after system, freeing worlds that had suffered under Krethian rule. Each liberation followed the same pattern, with human forces disabling garrison fleets in minutes and then offering friendship instead of demanding submission. Word spread faster than human ships could travel as freed worlds sent messages to enslaved ones. The ghost ships were real and they were coming to break the chains. But the Krethian Empire was not finished. On Krethia Prime, the Imperial Council made a desperate decision. They could not match human technology, but they could change tactics. Instead of large fleets that were easy targets, they would deploy small, fast attack groups. Instead of holding territory, they would strike at human ships directly. And instead of fighting fair, they would target the worlds humanity was trying to protect. If they could not defeat the ghost ships, they would make the cost of liberation too high to bear. Admiral Zethrak led the new strategy personally. His fleet was smaller now, just 80 ships, but they were the fastest vessels the Empire had. They would not try to box in the human ships or surround them. Instead, they would strike at liberated worlds after human forces moved on. They would destroy cities and orbital facilities and send a message that freedom came with a terrible price. It was a strategy born of desperation, but Zethrak believed it might work. The first strike came at Zareth 3 weeks after its liberation. Zethrak's fleet jumped in and began bombarding the capital city before human ships could respond. By the time Morrison's task force arrived, thousands were dead, and the planet's infrastructure was in ruins. Morrison felt rage building as he watched the destruction. The Krethians were targeting civilians specifically because they could not fight military forces. They were terrorists now instead of conquerors, but Morrison adapted faster than Zethrak expected. He left permanent garrison forces at each liberated world, with ships rotating in shifts to provide constant protection. He trained local defense forces and provided them with weapons and shield technology. Most importantly, he organized the freed worlds into a defensive network where each system would support the others. The liberation became a coalition, and humanity provided the military backbone but did not. Rule Zethrak tried his terror tactics at 3 more worlds, but each time found human ships already in position and ready to respond. His fast attack groups were not equipped for prolonged combat, and suffered heavy losses each time they engaged. After losing 30 ships in failed raids, Zethrak was forced to retreat back to core Imperial territory. The strategy had failed, and now the Empire faced rebellions on dozens of worlds with no way to suppress them. Done on Earth, Admiral Brooks received reports of Morrison's success and made a recommendation to the Security Council. Humanity should formalize its relationship with the freed worlds by creating an alliance based on mutual defense and cooperation. President Martinez agreed, and the Galactic Liberation Coalition was formed with Earth and 23 freed worlds as founding members. It was not an empire but a voluntary association, and each world maintained its sovereignty and independence. The Krethian Empire continued to crumble over the following year. More worlds rebelled and joined the coalition. Krethian fleets were defeated in system after system, as human ships appeared and vanished and turned Imperial strength into weakness. The mighty empire that had ruled for 3,000 years could not adapt fast enough to fight an enemy that rewrote the rules of war. Within 2 years of Morrison's first intervention at Pendra, the Krethian Empire controlled less than a quarter of its former territory. Admiral Zethrak requested a meeting with human representatives, and Morrison agreed to meet him in neutral space. They sat across from each other in a small diplomatic ship, and Zethrak looked at the human who had destroyed everything he knew. Morrison waited patiently for the Admiral to speak. Zethrak finally asked what humanity wanted, because they had proven they could destroy the Empire completely but had not done so. Why show mercy to conquerors and slavers? Morrison replied that humanity did not want territory or tribute or revenge. They wanted justice and peace in a galaxy where species could coexist without fear. The Krethian Empire could surrender and join the coalition as equals, or continue fighting until nothing remained. The choice belonged to Zethrak and his people. Zethrak sat in silence for a long time, processing what he had heard. Everything he believed about power and strength and conquest had been proven wrong by this one species. Zethrak made his decision, and 3 days later, the Krethian Empire officially surrendered. The Imperial Council dissolved itself, and Krethia Prime applied to join the Galactic Liberation Coalition as a member world. There would be trials for war crimes and reparations paid to victim worlds, but there would also be a chance for redemption. The Krethians who had ruled Through fear would learn to coexist through cooperation. Morrison stood on the bridge of the Wanderer 1 year after the surrender and looked at the tactical display showing coalition space. Over 100 worlds now worked together in the alliance humanity had helped create. Lisa Parker asked if he thought it would last, and Morrison said he did not know. Building something was always harder than destroying it, and there would be challenges ahead. But humanity had proven something important to the galaxy. They had proven that strength did not require cruelty, and victory did not require conquest. An unknown ship had appeared and then vanished at Pendra 1 year ago. That single moment of intervention had cascaded into the fall of an empire and the birth of a new age. The Crethean Empire never stood a chance because it was built